riots, volcanic eruption, flooding, or even crime. What does all of these have in common? All of these can be solved, all of these can be mitigated, all of these can be eradicated. But what have we been doing so far? What have we been doing so far is that we're avoiding these problems temporarily and going back straight at it, being vulnerable to it. We may be harmed in the process by doing this eventually. Therefore, my side wants to do something about it, which is prioritizing disaster mitigation over relocation. But before on, I would like to give a few pieces of setup to just set the grounds of today's debate. Firstly, what does a disaster look like? In this debate, I would define disaster as a series of events that harms people. Examples include flooding, crime, or even volcanic eruption. Secondly, what does disaster mitigation look like? Disaster mitigation is basically just to reduce crime rate by putting more security or controlling the disasters of volcanic eruption or even floods by building infrastructures or sending cleaning teams to prevent floods. Relocation. Relocation, in my view, is to move the civilians to places where they could avoid the disasters affected immediately, but they would be sent back after the disasters has been solved. Now, let's first understand what my mechanism looks like and how it would be implemented. Firstly, on context on what government has been doing. Currently, we could see that government always resorts to relocating civilians to somewhere safer when the disaster struck. Government would tend to wait for disasters to settle down before sending them back to their homes. Example, when Bali was struck with floods, government tried evacuating civilians to a shelter, and once the flood was resolved, they were sent back directly to Bali to their homes. Now, let me first highlight what does prioritizing disaster mitigation would look like. Instead of spending huge sums of money to relocate civilians temporarily, governments should build infrastructures that could help mitigate disasters. Example is investing in more security to lower crime rate or building walls around active volcanoes to prevent magma to destroy buildings or even investing more to prevent volcanic eruptions in the first place. And now let us first understand on how a side should win this debate. I believe that for a side to win this debate, they should be able to provide a mechanism that would impact our vulnerable actors to civilians best. Not only impacting the vulnerable actors the best, which is the civilians in this case, the mechanism that they propose should be feasible and cost efficient. And lastly, for my side to win, I have to prove that status quo is cost inefficient and unfeasible, and it just does more good than harm to our vulnerable actors. Whereas status quo does more harm and is more cost inefficient and more unfeasible. Now moving on to substantive. Layer 1, civilian safety. When we talk about areas that are prone to disasters, this would mean that no matter how many times government will move the civilians to somewhere safe, it is undeniable that these civilians, if they are sent back, they would be prone again to these disasters, right? It would end in an endless loop of civilians escaping, civilians facing the problem again and escaping again, and so on and so forth. There is no insurance that by relocating civilians in the future, they would not be harmed. Whereas in our side, my mechanism of building infrastructures, it directly deals with the problem, right? Because why? Because my mechanism directly counters the problem. It faces the problem. It doesn't dodge the problem temporarily. It directly faces it, and it just gives more opportunity to eradicate these problems in the first place. Layer 2, why my mechanism is more cost efficient. But first, by building infrastructures or enforcing policies that mitigate these disasters, government would only have to pay out a huge amount of sum once. In a worst case scenario that the cost of implementing my mechanism is more expensive than relocating civilians, my mechanism should be implemented. Why? Moving on to layer 3. My mechanism is so much more feasible. In some countries where relocation is not an option, civilians are forced to deal with the disasters alone. Examples of such is when country A is small. Therefore, when disaster strikes, despite having tons of funds, there is not enough time or resource to relocate. With this example, we can see that status quo, which side opposite is supporting, is unfeasible. What makes my mechanism so much more feasible is that the only thing countries have to do is fund out a huge amount of sum once, and infrastructures can be built, and that is it. Now, I would like to be moving on to my preamp of what side opposition can say. Firstly, side opposition may say that my mechanism is unfeasible because some countries cannot afford it. That is wrong. Why? Because no matter how poor a country is, they can sought after for help, let's say from UN nations or donation drives, is from the general public, right? Secondly, if they still relocate civilians when disaster strikes, therefore eventually the price will build up, right? Making it more expensive. Lastly, I would like to highlight that these investments would not cost over tens of billions of dollars. Therefore, it makes the statement so exaggerated, or side op is played in their best case scenario, which is the worst case scenario for us. Secondly, side op might say that our mechanism does not completely ensure 100% safety to civilians. That is true, despite our mechanism not having a 100% success rate. But what has a 100% success rate? Nothing, right? But then what does our mechanism offer? Our mechanism offers a higher success rate. Why? Because let's move on to analysis, right? Relocation takes a lot of time. Whereas if we have infrastructures, the problem would be eradicated effective immediately. We won't have to wait for transportation, we won't have to wait for evacuation through boats. It would not even happen in the first place, right? Ensuring a more safety for civilians. So in conclusion, side affirmative wins in providing more safety for civilians, which is proven compared to status quo, and this mechanism that side affirmative promotes is more cost efficient because we only have to do it once and the problem would be solved, and it is also more feasible because all the countries in the world can do it if they are willing to. Whereas in status quo, their mechanism, if they stick to status quo by relocation, it just leads to more harm and dangers, and that is why I am proud to propose. Thank you.